Welcome back, class. As you may recall, last week we were talking about the events of World War II, the major turning points. This week we're going to be talking about the Holocaust. Next week we'll round out by discussing just the impacts of World War II and the Holocaust, and then moving into the Cold War. So to get started talking about the Holocaust, you really have to dig into a bit of the history. The roots of the Holocaust go back to ancient times, all the way back to the Roman Empire and 70 in the current era. So in the year 70, the Romans destroy the Jewish state. They conquer them, they destroy the state, and there's something called a diaspora. And a diaspora is just where people spread out across the world in various directions. And so what you had were Jews moving into different parts of the Roman Empire, which of course today would be all over Europe. And in these places, they would form communities, and communities that were different, that stood out from the rest of Roman society and into the Middle Ages from the rest of European society. Now, they stood out for a number of reasons, partly because they retained their culture and religion in a way that many communities have a difficulty doing, but partly because of the way the host countries, the European countries, the Romans before them, the way that they would treat the Jews. And they treated them this way because by the time the Jews are arriving in the Roman Empire, Rome is beginning a shift towards Christianity. So at first, Christianity and Judaism coexist. They're there at the same time. And it's not to say that that the Christians and the Jews always get along, as is often the case. And as we've talked about earlier this year in class, where we talked about how Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are all religions of the book, right? They're all religions that have their core beliefs in the same original Old Testament books. And because of that actually increases the conflict between them, because when you have a lot of similarities, but slight yet important differences, those differences often lead to some of the worst arguments. And in history, this is an argument that is continuing to crop up and will continue to crop up for the foreseeable future. So Christians and Jews, for about the first 100 years, they're living alongside each other. But fairly quickly, as the Roman emperors begin to convert to Christianity, Christianity becomes the state religion. And with that, every other religion is going to start to face restrictions. And the Jews in particular, especially since they're, not a religion that had been founded in Rome, they're going to see some of the worst restrictions. The thing that really bothers the Christians is that the Jews have a belief in a Messiah, in a Savior, right? They believe that there is a Savior who is going to come one day to deliver them to the promised land. Well, because Jews and Christians both believe in the same beginnings of the Old Testament, it means that Christians also believed in a Messiah. The difference is that when Jesus came along, the Christians decided that that was the Messiah, and then they added his teachings to their beliefs. The Jews believed that Jesus was a false Messiah. He wasn't the one. And so they're still waiting. And so they've never added that New Testament into their belief system. Because of that, Christians in particular, they look at Jews as a group who has denied their Savior. And that is a major sticking point throughout history. Okay, so moving forward a little bit in time, as we get to the Middle Ages, say about 300 to 500, there are a number of restrictions that continue to be built and laid upon the Jews. So, for example, Jews are forbidden to marry Christians. They couldn't work in government. If there was a court case, if someone was accused of something, they weren't allowed to be witnesses in a case against a Christian. So you see that over time, this anti-Semitism, this hatred for Jews is going to start to build, and it becomes almost a tradition that grows throughout European history. And it's not done there. It will continue to grow all the way up until the Nazis conquer Germany. And you'll see this trend is on this up curve. So if we move forward a little bit further, 1095, you have the Pope declares a crusade, to retake the Holy Land that has been conquered by Muslim forces. Well, as the Crusaders roll out of Europe, as they go by boat, by land, and all these various ways, they encounter a lot of Jewish communities along the way. And as they do, they, that enmity rears its head, and the Christians slaughter many Jews, burn down their towns, and create just mass destruction. Fast forward just a little bit further, 1150, you have what's called the Blood Libel. This happens when Sir Thomas of Monmouth, he attempts to explain the mysterious disappearance of a young Christian boy by claiming that the Jews had horns and a tail and would eat Christians. And that tale, as insane as it sounds, will reverberate throughout history, and it's one of the early stereotypes that will compound as history moves forward, almost like ripples in a pond. But in this case, the ripples get bigger and bigger as history goes, because they're being reinforced by more events and more individuals who latch on to that stereotype and add their own nuance to it. So by the 1200s, Jews are required in some places to wear badges and pointy hats. We'll see that rear its head again when we get to the Nazis, right, where they'll use the Star of David, and we'll talk about that. In the 1300s, as the plague is ravaging across Europe, about a third of all Europeans, by estimates, die to the plague. So it creates huge unrest, it creates fear, it creates an attempt to explain why is this happening. And of course, in an extremely religious society, that explanation is often going to have a religious focus. And so in many cases, they would look around them, they would say, okay, well, who's different? Who stands out? And those are the people who often are going to be the first scapegoated. So during that period in Austria and Germany, for example, there are some estimates that claim about 100,000 Jews, men, women, and children, were burned alive. That brings us to the 1500s. In the 1500s, you may recall, Martin Luther, we talked about him at the very beginnings of our course. He's the founder of Protestantism. He, nails his letter to a church door and makes a proclamation that, hey, maybe we don't all have to be Catholics. Maybe we don't have to follow these particular strictures. We can have a more personal relationship with God. Well, he also writes a piece that might surprise you, called Jews and Their Lies. And in this piece, he claims that Jews are hungry for Christian blood, and he asks his followers to go out and murder Jews. So we see time and time again through history these reverberations continuing. Now, there are a couple other factors that are going to play into the stereotypes that are going to be built off of by the Nazis. First of all, during the Middle Ages, in many European societies, Jews were not allowed to own land. At the same time, Christians were not allowed to make loans for profit. So they called making a loan for profit, they called it usury, and it was considered to be a sin. So throughout European societies, you couldn't really have banks because no Christians were allowed to loan money and make money off of it. But in Judaism, there's no such stricture. So Jews can't own land, but they can create banks. And so what you find is that many Jews, as a way to make money, turn towards money lending. Now, that creates a very useful stereotype for the Nazis and throughout history here of Jews being greedy, of them going after people's money, of them mistreating the poor, of them constantly looking for an angle. We see this, in fact, in Shakespeare with the example of Shylock, the Jewish character in Shakespeare, who demands a pound of flesh, right? So what happens that compounds this, that makes this worse, is that Okay, so if you have the only banks in Europe really are Jewish banks, well, many of the governments of Europe would love to borrow money to build these huge cathedrals that they're producing, to help pay for the armies that they'll need in the mini wars that occur throughout this time. And if you're the leader of a major country and you borrow a little bit from a bank, well, okay, that's pretty cool. But if you borrow more and more and more, and you get to a point where it's really hard to pay off, well, you always have another option, especially if money lending is considered a sin, and the group that lent you money is a group that there's a great deal of prejudice against, so no one's really going to look at you funny if you do something to them. And so frequently what happens, of course, is that these leaders will then turn around and you'll see they'll go after these banks, or they'll go after Jews in general. And that kind of allows you not to have to pay your debts. So then we see from time to time for hundreds of years, another thing that happens to the Jews is they'll be expelled from one country or another, just kicked out. They'll say, go somewhere else. We see that in 1290 in England, in 1394 in France, and in 1492, same year that Columbus sails the ocean blue, right? In 1492 in Spain. So that brings us to one of the major events of the turn of the century, just as the 1800s are flipping over to the 1900s, right? The height of imperialism, the height of industrialization, 1894. There's a man named Alfred Dreyfuss. He's a Frenchman, and he's in the military. He's accused of selling secrets to the German military. It turns out there's no proof. The case falls apart, but the officers and the French government, one, they're embarrassed by, being incorrect, but two, they're looking for a scapegoat. And as a Jew, it fits with their images, their stereotypes already, and so they go ahead and they pin it on him. This is one called the Dreyfuss Affair. It's one of the major events leading in to the 1900s. As the 1900s progress, it's not just in France, it's not just in Germany. You see also in Russia, where we have mass poverty. Remember that you have tons of peasants who are extremely poor, and the Russian peasants are looking for someone to blame when things go wrong. And in Russian history, things always go wrong over and over and over again. So you get a continuance of sort of what happened when the Crusaders went through Jewish towns earlier. You get what's called a pogrom, where in some cases it's the Russian government sponsoring it, where the police will come through and they'll wipe out Jewish villages. In one case, I think 500 Jewish villages are wiped out. During the Russian Revolution, you see frequently Jews are scapegoated and they're rounded up. Some estimates say that as many as 60,000 were killed by the end of that. So this tradition of hatred and murder has been building since ancient Rome, one of the oldest traditions in European history. So that brings us to World War II. A lot of the things we're going to point out that the Nazis do should be familiar from what we've just discussed. First, one of the things that Hitler latches onto is he discusses the German people as what he calls Aryans. The Aryans for Hitler are the master race. He believes that every other race is inferior. In particular, he has a disdain for the Jews, the Roma, who are the Gypsies, the Poles, the Russians. He also is concerned about anyone with a mental disability, anyone who he would consider insane or an incurable illness. He's looking to what he would term purify the German race. Another term for this sort of belief is eugenics. Good genes is what that means. The idea that you have good bloodlines and bad bloodlines. That there are some people who, in the Nazis' words, pollute the gene pool. If you allow them to intermarry and have children, they're actually making humanity worse, less intelligent, less moral, less capable. Now, after World War I, many Germans were looking for someone to blame. And as you can see, there's already a tradition behind who you're going to blame when things go wrong. Now, in particular, if Hitler is saying that the Germans are the master race, then again, it brings up this question, and we talked about this in our earlier lectures. Well, why did you lose World War I? And Hitler's ready with a very simple answer, right? There were people within our country working against us, and those people were the Jews. Now, this messaging will ultimately lead to the systematic slaughter of the Jewish people, and we call that the Holocaust. So let's look at how the Holocaust ramps up, because even when we zoom into history and we're only looking at a 20-year period instead of more than 1,000 years, it still takes some time. Hitler and the Nazis build towards it. They don't just go there immediately. And we find this a lot in history. You know, if you try to make a major change out of nowhere, people often resist it. But if you just kind of slowly, step by step work towards it, it's hard for people to see where you're headed. It's hard for them to see that this is going to end horribly. So let's start with 1935. Hitler's in power. He's been in power for some years. He's starting to, step by step, build towards the Holocaust. In 1935, the Nuremberg Laws will strip Jews of their civil rights. And what that does is it's the first step to then begin restricting them, much as they were in the Middle Ages. And you'll see a major parallel here. They're working off a blueprint that Europe has already done, at least up to this point. Now, they'll go off the map by the end of it, but at this point, they're going step by step to reinstitute their own versions of things that we've already discussed. And you'll see that in three key things here. So the Nuremberg Laws limit the work that Jews can do, just as in the Middle Ages. They make it illegal to marry a Jew, just as it was for Christians in the Middle Ages. And Jews over the age of 6 will have to wear a yellow Star of David on their shoulder, much like the badges that they had to wear earlier. Now, of course, the point of the Star of David is that you can't look at someone and tell that they're Jewish, despite what the Germans would claim. And this is kind of proof of that, because they wouldn't need the star otherwise. So the Star of David lets them know who to discriminate against. Now, you might ask yourself, okay, well, why wear it? Well, the problem is that the Jews in Germany have not been hiding who they are. So your neighbors know, you probably have records in a synagogue that say that you were born if you're Jewish. And so with a little bit of research, they're going to find out. And at this point, no one imagines that they're going to murder everyone that they're labeling. So the thought is, well, okay, I wear the Star of David, things are going to be uncomfortable, it's going to be unfortunate, but if I don't and they find out, it's going to be worse. Okay, fast forward a little bit to 1938. We have what's called Kristallnacht. In English, that means the night of broken glass. And what happens on Kristallnacht is the Nazis go throughout Germany and they burn synagogues, they smash shop windows from Jewish shops, they ransack Jewish homes, they kill dozens of Jews, and then they do something rather interesting. And this is something you can only do in a society where the government completely controls the news. And what they do is they blame all of it on the Jews. They say that the Jews were running around, burning things down, killing people, breaking into shops. A clear falsehood, but who's going to challenge the Nazis? And so they use that as an excuse to arrest 20,000 Jews and to clamp down even further. And the next thing they clamp down on is one of the basic things that any totalitarian has to get a control of if they want to control the people. One of the basic rights in America has always been the right to bear arms. And there's a reason that it's the second thing on the list for the Founding Fathers. Because without the right to bear arms, it is difficult for the people to resist when the government goes off the rails. And so totalitarians, one of the first things they do is they seek to remove weapons that would allow people to resist. And so they confiscate firearms so that when they're ready to step it up even further and start doing even crazier things, the Jews will be that much more unable to resist. Okay, so just a few days later, on November 11th, the German government imposes what they call an atonement fine. Atonement means to make up for something. And the atonement fine is sort of reminiscent of what the Treaty of Versailles does to the Germans. So remember, Hitler's been telling the Germans, that Germany's been punished for all these things incorrectly, and we had to pay all this money. And so instead, he's now pointing the finger at the group that he's claiming is responsible for World War I and responsible for their loss in World War I and all these other things, and that's the Jews. And so the atonement fine is 1 billion German marks that the Jews have to pay, and they can pay in the form of confiscated property. Several weeks later, they announce exactly that they'll begin confiscating Jewish property. A few days after that, they pass laws forbidding Jews from driving cars, from riding in public transportation, from gathering in large parks. And you can see those are freedom of speech and movement types laws, other key elements if you want to be a free people, right? If you can't gather together, if you can't ride on mass transit, then it's impossible to make plans to defend yourself. How can you group together in a resistance if you can't even be in a group? And this is before Twitter, so there's really no way to communicate back and forth that easily to organize any kind of resistance. And this is often considered the beginning of the Holocaust, because from here on out, the Jews are now stripped of any ability to defend themselves, really. So by the end of 1939, a number of German Jews had done the one major thing they could to defend themselves from the insanity that's already unfolding around them, and that was to flee to other countries. At first, Hitler's actually even in favor of this. He says this is a way to get rid of what he calls the Jewish problem. But France, Britain, the US only allow about a few tens of thousands of Jews to immigrate, and then they shut the doors to immigration as well. Fairly quickly, that avenue is shut down. Now, luckily for the United States, one of those individuals who does escape is Albert Einstein. Okay. It's important to take a moment to point out there's a misconception often that, Jews did nothing to defend themselves in the midst of this. Now, admittedly, it's very difficult to do, and no one imagined that Hitler was going to attempt to wipe out an entire people. Even the most cynical of people would assume, okay, well, maybe he's going to kill a few people here and there. There have been pogroms in the past. Jews are always targeted. This happens over and over again, but we'll survive. We always do. No one had really an inkling of the extent to what the Nazis were going to attempt. That said, there's one very good example of the resistance that does develop. Once people begin to realize what's going on, they will attempt to resist. And that example is the Warsaw Uprising. So in late 1942, Warsaw, the capital city of Poland, had about 350,000 Jews living in it. And the Germans had been shipping more and more Jews there. So one of the first things they do before they start the mass slaughter is they start taking Jews and removing them from their homes and setting up neighborhoods that are fenced in and guarded, where they start packing the Jews into these neighborhoods that they've emptied out of everyone else. They call these neighborhoods ghettos. So Warsaw becomes really this huge ghetto where they have 350,000 Jews packed in together very tightly. And there's already issues then with starvation, with, kids who don't have parents anymore or who don't know where their parents are, dying on the streets. Things start to get really bad when you have that many people packed into an area and not allowed to leave. And of course, the Nazis aren't exactly shipping in food by the truckload. Meanwhile, they're removing people from the ghetto who were never seen again by the thousands. They get up to about 48,000 that they've removed, and then the Jews start to really question what's going on. The Nazis say, we're just shipping them somewhere else. But there's some rumors coming back that that's not what's really happening. And with that, you get an individual, Mordechai Anielewicz, who he and his followers will gather together. They'll take handguns, Molotov cocktails, which is basically alcohol in a glass with you light a piece of cloth on the end and you throw it in and it explodes in fire, right? They'll attack with anything they can put together. And they'll actually force the Germans out of the city. But by early 1943, the Germans come back with reinforcements, with tanks, with machine guns, the whole 9 yards. They go house to house, murder anyone they run into, and basically wipe out the ghetto. By the end, it's believed out of the 350,000 Jews originally in the ghetto, maybe fewer than 12,000 survived. Okay, so the Nazis begin by limiting Jews' rights, and then step by step, once they start running out of rights to eliminate, they begin rounding them up, and then they'll look for what Hitler and the Nazis call a final solution. A solution to what, you ask? The Jewish problem, as they would put it. So Hitler's genocide plan. Genocide is when you wipe out an entire race of people. It's kind of one of those disturbing things that we even have to have such a term. His genocide plan works roughly like this, and he has multiple facets to how he does this. One is he takes the SS and he sends his elite SS soldiers throughout the cities and the lands that the Germans occupy to round up men, women, and children, even babies in many instances. They will line them up, oftentimes make them dig a pit, and then sometimes they'll line them up in a row so that they can save bullets, fire that bullet, it'll pass through a number of individuals, and then they'll fall into the pit. So they make them dig their own pits before murdering them. Now they always shoot the men first, because what they found is that the men are less likely to resist if they think or have some hope that their wives and children might survive. Other Jews are rounded up and not immediately killed, but instead sent to concentration or labor camps. Basically, you end up with two types of camps. You have the death camps where the only purpose for the camp is to kill you. And then you have the labor camps where the purpose is to get you to do some work and feed you very little and work you very hard so that you'll die from the labor and the lack of food, but you'll make a profit for the Germans along the way. So in those labor camps, the Jews will be working 7 days a week. They'll often be fed little more than a bit of water or a bit of bread, very little food, right? Some sort of thin soup, sometimes potato peelings, and most inmates will lose 50 pounds almost immediately. Okay, let's talk about what happens when the Jews arrive at the camps. In particular, we'll use the example of Auschwitz, one of the most famous and terrible. So the whole key here is that the Germans want to be as efficient as possible. And they do this by attempting to leave open a sense of hope. What they find is when people still have a sense of hope, then they won't attempt crazy last-ditch efforts to escape or to fight back, right? If you think there's some hope, then you may kind of go along with it. And so at Auschwitz, the trains pull up to what looks like a regular train station. No hint that this is a death camp or a labor camp or any other type of thing. And when they're getting off the train, they're actually helped off by other Jews. Jews from the camps who were given special treatment in exchange for doing basic tasks like these. And were also fed a little bit better. At some of the death camps, they'd even have a band playing music to help organize this offloading. You can imagine that would be a sort of surreal event. Once they're off the train, they go through a process called selection. And with the process of selection, what they do is they would take the women and the old and the extremely young children who couldn't work, and they would put them in one line, and then they would take the men and younger women who they felt would be better laborers, and they would put them in another. Now, of course, they don't tell them any of this, they just split them apart, and anyone who refuses, of course, is going to be shot on the spot. And so they split them into these different lines, and off they go. Now, let's take a moment to talk about what happens to the women, the young children, the elderly, who are sent off to the gas chambers. They'll be stripped down, they'll be handed a towel, and in many cases, a bar of soap. The implication is that they're sending them off to the showers. And the idea there, of course, is that, again, to reduce resistance. When they get to the showers, they're marched into a fairly large room if you just have a few people, but in some cases they'll pack as many as 2,000 into this concrete enclosed space. And then the door slams shut, and out of a hole in the ceiling they would drop Zyklon B, or prussic acid. It's a poison gas that is very similar to the types of things that were used in World War I. It's going to suffocate in the most agonizing way everyone in that room. Okay, I've been struggling with how to end this particular video. There are few events in human history more horrifying than the Holocaust, and no video could ever really accurately portray the horrors for those who lived through it. So I think that the best way to end is with a picture and a question. As you look at this gate, which we saw earlier, that says Arbeit macht frei, which is German for work will set you free. Every prisoner on their way to toil until death would have seen this sign. What were the Germans trying to say with it? Why offer hope to those who you've condemned to death and torture? Is it just that the heart of Nazism is that rotten and cruel, that it was one last twisted joke left for the people that were their victims?